anyone can put forward an interpretation of a text. How did the early church interpret this? And so, one thing that's oftentimes um, brought up when trying to give historical credence to specific interpretations of biblical ecclesiology is St. Clement of Rome. Obviously, writing in the late first century, he was one of the first significant biblical writers outside of the New Testament writers. Obviously, if you were to make a list of like the three oldest Christian texts outside the New Testament, it would be Clement of Rome's letter to the Corinthians, the Didache, which probably came a little bit earlier, and then the letters of Saint Ignatius, Ignatius of Antioch. And so a lot of people will point out the fact that Clement of Rome was the Bishop of Rome, and his letter to the Corinthians was written to obviously a Greek church, a church not under his direct immediate jurisdiction, because he was the Bishop of Rome, and so it wouldn't have been under his direct jurisdiction. So the fact that you see a bishop writing a letter to try to resolve issues in another church, not his own, uh, seemingly signifies that the Pope has a certain level of jurisdiction that, at least in some instances, goes beyond the limits of the Roman Church. So, do you see that as signified at all in the writings of St. Clement as something necessitated either by what he wrote or by his historical circumstances? Or do you
Yeah.
think that's something that Catholic apologists and theologians read into uh, St. Clement's writings?
Well, so I do think we should be careful. So, from a historical, scientific point of view, somebody who approaches St. Clement's letter and tries to do just a normal historical observation slash investigation, exegesis of it, um, what you can glean is that during this time, uh, for somebody to be writing a letter of this size, on a matter of scandal and church leadership at Corinth, um, it's reminiscent of a leadership style. So Paul wrote letters to Corinth, right? And he expected the church to read his letters and obey those letters. Not all of them did. Even in the apostolic times, we know that Paul said there were certain persons at Corinth that may have had questions about Paul's leadership. Well, during this time where you've got missionaries and preeminent apostolic men, they have a certain position of authority. And to see the Bishop of Rome writing to Corinth, it kind of fits against that backdrop where he's taking a position kind of like an apostle, writing to exhort and to encourage, and also to authoritatively uh, admonish them to repentance. And so it at least shows that Rome has a posture of apostolic leadership. Now, the when you put Clement's letter together with the other historical evidences around the first, second, and third century, it becomes clear that Rome was acting in what would be understood as an official capacity. You know, does the text itself prove that? I would say to a pure skeptic who's coming with no desire to read it in the historical context or against the larger ecclesial context of the native church's understanding of Rome, it's probably limited on what you can get out of it. I wouldn't say you could prove Vatican I from it, for example. But when you put it together with all the jewelry of the other evidences in early Christianity, it becomes clear that Clement took a position that he felt he was responsible to try and pastorally fix the problem all the way in the Greek peninsula in a little city called Corinth.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, I think this sort of attests to a larger issue where certain ideas or theological concepts present in Scripture become more explicit over time. So obviously, what I'm about to say is, probably glossing over several hundred years of theological development. But if you look at the period between, let's say, Clement and then the height of the patristic period or the late patristic period, what is the vision of the papacy, of Rome's, the church's view of Rome's status within the church in terms of authority? What is the vision that begins to come into view? And what did specific church fathers have to say about this?
Yeah. So, I mean, you got to put yourself back in, late antiquity. This is not the time where you've got instant global communication like we have today.
Yeah, to say the
So
least.
most people relied on local structures. If you live in a little town called, Manhattan, New York, New York, New York,
Yeah.
if you live in Newark, New Jersey, Orlando, Florida, wherever you're at, if you don't have any kind of way to pick up a phone and instantly talk to people cities away, you don't have a way to get on Zoom or, face chat and do all these things. Your communication with the outside world is dependent on travel. And travel at this time is not in cars. It's not, the technological age wasn't anywhere near.
Yeah.
And so you either were walking, you were on horseback, you had different kinds of methods of transportation. But that was something, and people traveled all the time, don't get me wrong, but it was a venture. It was laborious, it was long. And so when the church spread from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to Antioch to, Ephesus, Philippi, Colossae, all these cities, the idea was to establish something strong enough in its local perimeter that could be self-sustaining, right? And so they weren't, it was not as if everybody had a way to contact Rome and everybody was listening to Rome like headline news every day. um, but but when affairs on a matter of discipline or of doctrine reached a level where souls were being aggravated and local solutions were not being successful, it was clear that they would go to certain primatial cities to find juridical deliberation. We see this in Alexandria, for example, in Egypt. We see this in Antioch and further east. Um, there are some other cities that even had that role, sort of like a sub metropolitan or even a supra metropolitan role. They would gather into synods, so there was a little bit of an organization at early. Um, but Rome, which would require for Easterners a hefty boat trip across the Mediterranean, for North Africa, still a boat trip nonetheless. People in the Italian peninsula, in the Italian peninsula, who lived south or north of Rome, and even northwest abroad into what became Francia, Gaul, Spain, and the British Isles. When a matter deserved strong ecclesiastical treatments, they would take it to Rome. They would pay the money for the postage. They would pay the money for the travel to take it to Rome, and they called Rome the Apostolic See because it was understood to be the throne of the apostles and sort of acting like Jerusalem in the early primitive mission that St. Luke records in the book of Acts. So fathers talk about this all the time. The first time it really gets put into like a conciliar decree is at the Council of Sardica 343, which is in the 4th century. But before that, you have instances, historical, events that all show what I'm about to say. But at the Council of Sardica, they basically said, look, whenever a certain bishop feels like his condemnation for any kind of crime or defection in faith, if he felt that he was mistreated by the local trial of his region, he could make an appeal to the Bishop of Rome. And the Bishop of Rome would then decide whether a retrial was merited or not. And if he didn't think it was merited, then the original sentence was solid, right? But you see already Rome having this juridical role, sort of taking on the parameters, geopolitical um, methodology of Rome, taking it into the church, baptizing it into the church. And so, local metropolis would have synodical deliberations. But Rome chiefly had a position of leadership on authority and discipline. And it was soon to be clear from the documentary evidence that this was not because Rome's civil preeminence or it was such a beautiful city.
Yeah.
It was because Christ had commissioned one of the apostles, namely Peter, to shepherd the flock of God universally, and that position redounds to the lineal successors of Peter at the Roman city church. And so the Roman see became known as the see or the throne, the cathedra Petri, the chair of Peter. And as we get into the Middle Ages, we see this when you have ecumenical councils, theological controversy. They're all making huge reference to the divine institution of leadership, primacy, authoritative doctrinal power in the office of Peter in Rome.
And so, but when exactly do you start seeing the phrase the seat of Peter, the throne of Peter, the apostolic see? When exactly do you start seeing phrases like that come into use in the church?
So the first time I think we see Cathedra Peter or Throne of Peter is with the writings of Saint Cyprian of Carthage, and he is early 3rd century Roman citizen. He was a lawyer, later convert. He converted in his 30s. And there had been some controversies related to church practice in North Africa and Rome and other places in the West, like in Arles and uh, different areas in the northwest of the Italian peninsula where it required some episcopal activity. And Cyprian understood that. He made reference in one of his epistles that Rome is the the chair of Peter, the source of episcopal unity, and he calls it the Ecclesia Principalitum, the church, which the principal church is what he calls it, which means it's the primatial church in relation to all the other churches. But after him, it's pretty much used by many authors. The first in the Ecumenical Council of Ephesus 431, we see Greek bishops together with the Latin legates of the Apostolic See making claims that Peter's authority, Peter's chair, the keys of the kingdom, the lineal successors of Peter are in Rome, and they speak of it as if it's something that's been known in all the ages up to 431.
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
so they're definitely displaying what they understand to be the ancestral tradition of the Christian world. And so that certainly gets echoes in Saint Ambrose of Milan, Saint Augustine of Hippo, Saint Optatus of Milevis, another North African, who wrote a 7-volume work against the Donatists, a certain figure at the time named Parmenion. This 7-volume work, it hinges on the fact that the Donatists were not in communion with the principal church, the matrix and source of episcopal unity, which is the chair of Peter. Optatus gives such a great treatment of the role of Peter and what that chair signifies for the unity of the visible church.